Wendi Roewer is the Field Intelligence Manager for the Drug Enforcement Administration, Denver Field Division. She oversees the DEA intelligence program for the four-state region, consisting of Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, and Utah. She's been with the DEA for over 20 years. Prior to working in Denver, she worked at DEA headquarters in Washington, where she was assigned to the Financial Investigation Section.
Well, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to brief you today on some of what we see happening with regard to black market marijuana production and trafficking and some of the organizations behind it. So, since marijuana was full-on legalized recreationally in 2012, we've seen a precipitous increase in trafficking organizations setting up large-scale marijuana production operations in Colorado. The bottom line is that Colorado's marijuana laws are so permissive and marijuana production is so profitable that many criminal organizations currently control networks consisting of hundreds of grow sites capable of producing massive amounts of marijuana and marijuana products. All of it is sold on the black market, so there's obviously no tax revenue going to the state. Most of it is sold outside of Colorado in markets where voters have not necessarily elected to legalize. As you all know, across the country, 30 states now, I think, plus Washington, D.C., have some form of legalized marijuana. So why has Colorado become such a primary source for weed? It's largely because Colorado's laws allow for large, unregulated, private grows. With regard to marijuana production and home grows, Colorado is the total outlier among states that have legalized. Most other states that have legalized marijuana don't allow for home grows. Of those that do, most are fairly restrictive, anywhere from 4 to 16 plants. Then there's Colorado, up to 99 plants per medical marijuana patient. There's actually no legal limit on how much marijuana a physician can recommend for a patient. It's medicine, right? The doctor has to decide how much medicine his patient's condition requires. And for about $500 cash, there are more than a few physicians in Colorado who will provide patient recommendations for large numbers of plants. A medical marijuana patient can still get a recommendation for more than 99 plants. He just has to get a licensed marijuana business to grow anything above the 99 plants that he has in his recommendation. So coincidentally, there are no current recommendations in Colorado for more than 99 plants. It wasn't even until last year, 2017, that patients and private caregivers were limited to the 99 plants. Up to that point, there was no limit. And there's no mechanism at the state or the local level to document or regulate home grows, even these large ones that we're going to talk about. And so, traffickers have been able to egregiously exploit the medical marijuana system. So Amendment 20 made medical marijuana every Coloradan's constitutional right back in 2000. Most of the large residential grows that we encounter operate under the parameters of what is allowed under Amendment 20 and the medical marijuana system. Anyone in Colorado can get a medical marijuana card with the recommendation of a doctor. The law as written allows a patient to grow up to 6 plants unless his doctor recommends more. The vast majority of medical marijuana patients, 93% of them, cite severe pain as their qualifying condition. In fact, since the Department of Public Health began posting these numbers in 2009, severe pain has been the qualifying condition for well over 90% of medical marijuana patients. Keep in mind, recreational marijuana has been legal since 2012, yet as of October, we have over 89,000 medical marijuana patients in the state. Of those 89,000 patients, almost 11,000 of them have extended plant count recommendations, or what we call EPC recommendations, that allow them to grow anywhere from 11 to 99 plants. Under recreational marijuana, you're strictly limited to growing just 6 plants. This is an example of an actual EPC recommendation. This patient's severe pain in his back and his neck entitle him to 99 plants and 33 ounces so that he can make concentrates and edibles. This document was actually found in a vehicle that was pulled over in Kansas with about 240 pounds of marijuana on its way to the East Coast. So then in 2012, Colorado voters approved Amendment 64, which allowed for recreational marijuana use and production. It allows adult residents to grow up to 6 marijuana plants. It also opened up some new loopholes for traffickers to exploit. First, Amendment 64 allows an individual to possess any marijuana or marijuana product that is derived from his 6 plants. So if an individual is in possession of a large amount of marijuana, he can simply claim that it all came from his 6 plants, that he's just a really, really good grower. Secondly, Amendment 64 allows any adult in Colorado to assist any other adult in Colorado in possessing, growing, processing, or transporting their marijuana. So consequently, large grows or large quantities of processed marijuana are often justified through the claim that the resident is assisting others. Again, there's no mechanism at the state or local level to document recreational marijuana home grows. So there may be 60 plants in my grow, but I tell you, well, those are my 6 plants, plus my mom's 6 plants, my brother's 6 plants, and 7 of my friends, they grow at our place. We've got a growing co-op. There's no practical means for local police to verify whose marijuana is being grown or whose marijuana is being stored in any given location. Now, last November, a Western Colorado District Court trial illustrated just how permissible Colorado's laws are with regard to possessing large amounts of marijuana. In 2013, sheriff's deputies responded to a call regarding a suicidal woman. When they got to the residence, they found 30 pounds of harvested marijuana. The woman claimed that she and her adult son had produced the 30 pounds from their 12 combined recreational plants. The investigation showed that the 30 pounds actually contained more than 12 different strains of marijuana, which cast some doubt on her claim. But nevertheless, the jury found the woman not guilty. Her attorney successfully convinced the jury that Colorado law doesn't limit how much marijuana somebody can possess. He argued that Colorado's marijuana laws are vague, and since they don't address how much marijuana somebody can possess, there must be no legal limit. Now, the state is starting to see residential grows as a problem. In January of this year, 2 new laws went into effect. One places a limit of 12 plants that can be grown on a residential property. The law doesn't restrict an individual from growing more than 12 plants. It merely restricts him from growing more than 12 plants on a residential property. And that's defined as any property with a residential structure, so it does include outbuildings. Higher plant counts may still be grown on non-residential property, such as industrial or commercially zoned properties, or simply on land that doesn't contain a residential structure. The other new law clarifies what the term assist means in Amendment 64. It specifies that assist does not mean that someone can grow someone else's recreational marijuana for them. And this was aimed at those large grows where an individual claims that he's growing for all of his family members and friends in order to justify the large grow. So the question is whether or not these measures will have an impact on DTO, drug trafficking organization, marijuana production in Colorado. Well, from our perspective, they're not, and for a variety of reasons. First, these groups have invested heavily in acquiring and equipping their grow operations. Much of the grow equipment, the air conditioning units that we find in the Cuban-operated grow houses, that was all transported to Colorado from Florida. And they've invested in the properties themselves. DTOs have purchased many of their grow houses. They also tend to rent many of them. And when they rent, they often pay hefty deposits up front. They pay higher than market value rent payments. And they do this most often to keep the homeowners away from the property. So at this point, DTOs have established massive grow networks throughout the state with that equipment and in those properties. Marijuana production operations are firmly established, well entrenched in many communities throughout Colorado. There are literally thousands of DTO-operated large-scale grow sites throughout the state. We know from our investigations, specifically through intercepted conversations, that they've become comfortable hiding in plain sight. They're taking their chances that they're not going to get caught, even with the new 12-plant cap. Cuban DTOs in particular are moving into many rural communities where they can be more isolated. This is clearly a problem for law enforcement and sheriff's offices in those areas. They're often overwhelmed just by the sheer numbers of grow operations that they have in their jurisdictions. Also, there are signs that the DTOs are adapting by acquiring more warehouse space, even setting up grows in underground bunkers. We've seen them set up grows in large trailers, portable trailers that can be moved. Asian DTOs have also acquired thousands of properties that are used as grow sites. And what we see with many of these cells is that they'll be concentrated in certain areas, in certain neighborhoods. They'll make a concerted effort to acquire a number of properties in the same neighborhoods, on the same streets, on the same cul-de-sac. We've seen them purchase numerous properties in new communities, homes that haven't even been built yet. They'll buy up most or all of the lots on a street. Also, the Asian DTOs have acquired many local businesses in Colorado that are used to facilitate their trafficking and their money laundering operations. And I'll get into this in more detail. Another important factor to note is that marijuana growers have well-established support systems in Colorado. Obviously, there's no shortage of grow stores to supply them with equipment, seeds, fertilizers, whatever they need. There are a lot of employees at grow stores that have side jobs working as bud tenders or trimmers in black market grows. They get a lot of good contacts working in the grow stores. But it goes well beyond that. There are property managers and real estate investors specializing in finding residential properties and warehouse space for marijuana growers. They charge well above market value, but DTOs are willing to pay that in order to expand their operations. Online listings for available properties will often advertise that they're 420 friendly, or they have unfinished basements or outbuildings or garages. There are also grow operations that are strictly limited to providing clones or starter plants to black market grows. So if law enforcement executes a search warrant and destroys all the plants within a grow, they'll have new starter plants growing in the same location within no time at all. Over and over again, we'll take down a grow site only to see it up and operational again within a matter of days or weeks, either with the same growers who didn't get arrested or with new growers brought in by the DTO cell head or the 420-friendly property manager. It's easy to see why so many traffickers decide to come to Colorado to set up home grows. It's incredibly profitable and it's not too risky. With just an average amount of knowledge and experience, a grower can produce 1 to 2 pounds of marijuana per plant per 90-day growing cycle. Now that's conservative. Many of the home grows that we see contain huge plants capable of producing much more than that. But we'll stick to the 2 pounds per plant per growing cycle. So 6 marijuana plants will potentially produce 48 pounds of marijuana in a year, right? 12 pounds multiplied by 4 growing cycles. Now, in-state marijuana prices have dropped to about $800 a pound. The market is, at this point, oversaturated. So with little effort and little risk, a person can make at least $38,000 in a year from just his 6 plants. Now, if the person is willing to take the marijuana out of state, where it commands at least $3,000 a pound, he stands to make $144,000 in a year from just his 6 plants. At a yield of 1 to 2 pounds per plant per growing cycle, which again is conservative, a 50-plant grow will produce up to 400 pounds of finished marijuana in a year. It's about 500 joints a day. At $3,000 a pound, which again is an accurate, conservative, out-of-state price, that will earn up to $1.2 million in a year. A 99-plant grow will produce up to 800 pounds of marijuana in a year, or about 1,000 joints a day, and that will earn up to $2.4 million in a year. Most of the trafficking organizations producing marijuana in Colorado have the experience and the resources to produce at least 3 pounds per plant per 60 to 90 day growing cycle. So for every 100 plants that it cultivates, a DTO can potentially produce up to 1,800 pounds of marijuana in a year. Sold out of state at $3,000 a pound, that's as much as $5.4 million in a year. And so we have lots of criminal organizations in Colorado operating networks of grow houses in order to produce large amounts of marijuana to send out of state. And this is what we have in thousands of homes throughout Colorado. All of these photos that I'm going to show you are from actual Colorado grow sites. I didn't pull them off Shutterstock or anything like that. These grows are in high-end neighborhoods, in suburbs, in rural communities, every corner of the state. Since FY14, DEA offices in Colorado have been involved in over 300 search warrants related to black market marijuana home grows. We've destroyed over 90,000 plants and seized over 10,000 pounds of processed marijuana from home grows in Colorado. That doesn't include the large outdoor grows on public lands. These grows were discovered earlier this year after officers responded to a call of shots fired at a home. The husband and wife, both transplants from Florida, had 2 residential grows. This one had 352 plants, 33 pounds of harvested weed, and about 1,300 clone plants. This photo is from a January search warrant. 4 adults and 2 children were living in this house. One of the adults had previously been arrested and deported to Cuba just a few months prior. These are photos from a 100 plant grow that was discovered earlier this year by firefighters who were evacuating homes near an ongoing wildfire. A 780 plant indoor home grow was discovered in rural Park County back in June. Along with the weed, sheriff's deputies found cocaine and diverted pharmaceutical drugs. So what do you do when you have almost 800 plants? Well, in this case, they ran them through a chipper. In April, sheriff's deputies seized 66 plants and 20 pounds of harvested marijuana from a grow in this house. But just take a look at all the chemicals and the fertilizers and the pesticides that were found in the home. Where do you suppose all that stuff ends up? Residential homes were not designed to grow large quantities of marijuana. The grow lights and the equipment require more power than what's available in most residential homes, so they alter the electrical systems. The wiring and the ballast get super hot, which has resulted in many house fires, like this one. This was a $700,000 home in a gated country club community that backs right up to national forest land. The house burned in January. If it had been a dry day in July, that likely would have turned into a major wildfire. The ballasts and the electrical alterations were determined to be the cause of the fire. The elderly homeowner had no idea that her tenants had converted the basement of her house into a 58-plant grow. More and more, we're seeing these groups tap directly into underground power lines, bypassing utility meters. Another huge potential for fire. It's also the cause of a lot of blown transformers and neighborhood blackouts, the costs of which are passed on to the customers who actually pay their power bills. Flammable fertilizers and chemicals are often stored inside these grow houses. All of these pose clear hazards to firefighters or police officers responding in an emergency situation. Sometimes things like flooring and structural support, they get in the way, so we'll just cut through those in order to run ventilation tubing and wiring. The photo at the bottom left, that was actually a second floor bedroom. They cut out the subfloor in order to run the ventilation tube up through there. A firefighter or police officer responding during an emergency situation would have no idea that if he steps on that, he'll fall straight through. In October, 5 Florida-based Cuban DTO members were arrested and over $1 million worth of marijuana was seized in Pueblo County. The grow house was actually condemned by county authorities for the electrical alterations and for the unknown chemicals and gases that they detected. Now, there are 2 primary means by which marijuana that's produced in Colorado is reaching markets east. First are independent growers. These are usually Colorado-based. They find home grow sources and they set up deals for out-of-state buyers. Generally, the out-of-state customers make the trip, or they'll send a courier to Colorado to pick up the marijuana. This protects the growers and the brokers from the risks associated with traveling with large amounts of marijuana or large amounts of cash across state lines. But deals like this have created opportunities for plenty of ripoffs. An out-of-state customer who travels to Colorado with a large amount of cash to purchase weed from a seller that he found on Craigslist often ends up getting ripped off by the seller, who takes his cash but offers no marijuana in return. Or sometimes it's the buyer who decides, well, he'd rather get his weed for free, so he robs the seller of his marijuana at gunpoint. So what we're seeing is more and more reports of these out-of-state buyers traveling with weapons in order to protect their money and their weed, and this obviously presents a risk to the troopers in Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma who happen to pull them over. So sometimes Craigslist sales don't go quite as planned. Last year, a Colorado sheriff put his personal SUV up for sale on Craigslist. He got an offer, but instead of cash, he was offered 4 pounds of weed, so he accepted the offer. So aside from hundreds and hundreds of independent brokers and growers, we have bona fide criminal drug trafficking organizations, DTOs, capitalizing on Colorado's lax environment. Of the DTOs producing marijuana in Colorado, Cuban criminal organizations out of South Florida are among the most prolific. They're highly organized, they're sophisticated, and they're probably still the largest in number. It was early in 2014 when we started noticing large-scale marijuana grow operations popping up throughout Colorado by these Cuban organizations from Florida. Cuban DTOs based in South Florida have long been involved in indoor marijuana production. It's been a niche market of theirs for decades. So it was sort of a natural transition for them to start growing in Colorado, where the laws essentially allow for it. Early on, there was direct oversight by the DTO bosses in Florida. Florida-based leaders would send cells of workers to establish and maintain residential grows. They dispatched coordinators to Colorado to acquire and equip residential properties, to oversee grow operations, and to orchestrate out-of-state shipments. Operational funding to pay for supplies, utility, rent, that was often sent directly from Florida. Sometimes the DTO leaders themselves traveled to Colorado to oversee large harvests or large shipments. It's still the case that the grows in Colorado are tied to these larger DTO networks in South Florida. However, many of the grow operations appear to be operating a little more independently than they were just a few years ago. They've become, again, well entrenched, firmly established in Colorado at this point. So rather than taking day-to-day operational direction or receiving operational funding from the DTO leaders in Florida, local cell heads largely run their own organizations in Colorado. They produce marijuana that they sell to various brokers, who then sell it to the DTO bosses for distribution in their East Coast markets. But despite more independence, Colorado grow networks are still deeply plugged into the well-established money laundering operations of the Cuban organizations based in Florida. Through a myriad of business fronts and shell companies, marijuana money is laundered, along with proceeds from other various drug and criminal activities through trade-based money laundering schemes. Cuban DTOs control thousands, literally thousands of grow sites in Colorado. The DEA office in Colorado Springs has identified over 650 of them just in El Paso County alone. This is a new dynamic for law enforcement in Colorado. We're now a source production state. The ultimate leadership of these DTOs, they're in South Florida. The money for the sale of the weed often changes hands in the East Coast markets where it's sold. The proceeds are laundered through front businesses and bank accounts in other states, even other countries. So how do you move up the food chain? How do you effectively target these DTO leaders and their vast amounts of assets when you're dealing with physically dismantling hundreds and hundreds of grows spread throughout the state? These are poly-drug, poly-crime organizations involved in much more than just marijuana trafficking. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I mean, it's not like we have folks operating grows in Colorado that steal tractor-trailer loads filled with opioids. Oh wait, that actually did happen. These guys were members of a Miami-based cargo theft ring. They stole a tractor-trailer, the entire rig. The load contained almost 9 million hydrocodone tablets. Within just a couple months of that heist, 2 of the 3 were in Colorado, operating grow houses. In fact, Hurtado Cruz on the bottom right there, he was actually arrested in a Colorado grow house. When the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami rounded up 55 of its most violent offenders, one of them was found by U.S. Marshals in a Colorado grow house. At the time of his arrest, officers seized 56 pounds of marijuana packaged and ready for shipment. Cuban criminal organizations in Florida are deeply involved in financial crimes, insurance fraud, mortgage fraud, credit card skimming, and sure enough, we're seeing an increase in credit card skimming across Colorado. In fact, we've been made aware of many criminal Cuban-operated grow houses through local police departments that are investigating credit card skimming operations. We've seen home invasions in which DTO members rip off other grows once the marijuana is harvested. So when a marijuana grow is ready to harvest, it's really obvious. There's a lot of activity that starts to happen at the house. They bring in these huge trimming machines. They bring in large numbers of workers to trim the plants. So other traffickers see this happening, and once the marijuana has been all trimmed and harvested, they force their way in at gunpoint and they take the weed. So what we're finding is that the workers within these grow houses are almost always armed in order to prevent rip-offs. Weapons have been found at every Cuban grow site in Colorado at which DEA has executed search warrants. In a rural community in eastern Colorado, there are literally hundreds of Cuban grow operations. And there have been reports by members in the community of DTO members sort of casing out all the other homes in the community to identify which ones have grows in them because they're potential targets for rip-offs. In western Colorado, rural sheriff's offices are dealing with rip-off teams that have been sent from Florida. They're targeting all home grows, Cuban and non-Cuban. A source reported to us that Cuban DTO members will hang out at the grow stores, and when they see a customer purchasing large amounts of equipment, they'll follow them away to identify the location of the grow. It's a potential target for rip-off. There have been homicides that result from grow house rip-off attempts. Earlier this year in El Paso County, one individual was killed and another shot at a Cuban grow site. The shooter was later shot and killed by sheriff's deputies, but not before a deputy was wounded in the exchange. This was the scene in a Cuban grow house in the small town of Walsenburg a couple years ago. The town is so small there's no police department. This was first reported as a home invasion during which the homeowner shot and killed the assailant. Turned out, though, that both the shooter and the victim were Cuban DTO members. They were actually partners in the grow. The victim had surfaced in at least 2 other grow operations that we knew about in northern Colorado. Some of the cells in Colorado have smuggled individuals directly from Cuba to work in these grows. These people are sometimes forced to work for the organization for a prolonged period of time in order to pay them back for getting them into the country and setting them up in a grow. Well, sometimes when they're nearing the end of this sort of indentured servitude, the DTO will send members in to steal a harvest or 2, which then requires that they work for the organization for even longer. Likewise, there have been instances of females brought to Colorado by the DTO to work in the grows. Well, when the grow gets ripped off, or doesn't produce enough, or husband or boyfriend gets arrested, then the DTO forces them into prostitution in order to pay them back. The presence of Cuban DTOs has spawned instances of violence and intimidation. Members of a Cuban DTO in rural southern Colorado openly displayed weapons to intimidate neighbors, utility workers, even firefighters that attempted to come onto their properties. On one occasion, a neighbor had shots fired over her head by a DTO member who felt she was walking too closely to one of their grows. In March of this year, a sheriff's deputy in an unmarked car was followed and harassed by a vehicle while he was driving on a remote road late at night in an area that's full of Cuban grow operations. Well, when the vehicle was pulled over, officers essentially found a Cuban rip-off team 4 Cuban males in a rented car, loaded shotgun, crowbar, clippers, and a few marijuana trimmings. Asian trafficking groups, specifically Chinese organizations, are quickly catching up to the Cubans in terms of their organization, their sophistication, and the numbers of grows that they have in Colorado currently. Cells of growers have been sent by DTOs in California, Canada, and the East Coast. Unlike the Cuban groups, who send almost everything that they produce out of state, the Asian groups will often sell to local street gangs. They also sell to buyers who travel from other states and transport the marijuana back to those markets. But they also source large amounts of marijuana to their DTO customer bases in the East Coast, largely the Asian gangs. Like the Cuban groups, it's really no surprise that they are capitalizing on Colorado's environment. Asian DTOs in Western Canada, the Pacific Northwest, Northern California have long been involved in indoor marijuana production. So it makes perfect sense that they've moved much of this to Colorado, where they can hide in plain sight. Like the Cuban and other DTOs, the Chinese are largely poly-drug and poly-criminal. In their East Coast markets, Asian DTOs distribute not only marijuana, but other drugs, including ketamine, which is in high demand in Asian drug markets. And sure enough, we're running across ketamine in our Chinese grows in Colorado. Individuals are often smuggled from China or transported from the garment districts in New York and Los Angeles to work in these grows. A couple of years ago, DEA executed a search warrant at a Chinese-operated grow site in rural western Colorado. There were over a dozen undocumented Chinese workers at the site. A couple of them cooperated, at least initially. They said that they had been working in the LA garment district in a warehouse, but one day they were all loaded onto a van and told they were going to go work on a farm in Colorado. The biggest threat posed by the Chinese organizations is the fact that they are prolific international money launderers. Now, this is not a new thing. The Chinese underground banking system has existed for generations as a way to move money for the Chinese diaspora. It's also been used for decades to move illicit proceeds for Chinese organized crime. Well, beginning in roughly 2013 or so, the government in China began cracking down on rampant capital flight out of the country. A big part of that capital flight was money that had been pilfered from the Chinese government and the economy through corruption and crime. Well, when the government imposed a limit of $50,000 a year that a Chinese citizen can transfer out of China, most turned to the underground banking system to move their money out. So underground bankers suddenly had a huge demand to deliver currency outside of China. Well, what's a huge source for currency outside the financial system? Particularly cash, particularly US dollars. It's drug trafficking, right? So around that same time, Chinese underground bankers began laundering drug cash for Colombian and Mexican trafficking organizations. This gave them access to large amounts of US dollars that they could in turn provide to the Chinese citizens trying to move their vast wealth out of China. Today, the Chinese are the premier money launderers for all kinds of criminal organizations, including the Mexican DTOs that distribute cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin throughout Colorado and elsewhere. They're the most efficient, they're the most global in scope, and they're the cheapest when it comes to international money movement. They charge as little as 2 to 3% to launder drug proceeds for the Mexican DTOs. So they have a lot of business. So in Colorado, we not only have these marijuana grows to deal with, but also these extensive money laundering networks. Investing in real estate is one of the principal ways that the Chinese are integrating their wealth into economies outside of China. And so we see them purchasing hundreds and hundreds of grow houses in Colorado. Not only that, but huge numbers of local businesses, Asian restaurants, nail salons, ice cream shops. They're being acquired by members of these DTOs to facilitate the movement of illicit proceeds as part of these international money laundering networks. This chart is a current snapshot of a network of grows operated by Chinese cells that we have targeted in just one investigation. I realize you can't really read anything on the chart, but I included it simply to illustrate what we're up against. This chart shows the properties and individuals that have been identified just in Colorado alone. There are up to 854 properties associated with this organization. This transnational criminal organization, this TCO, has ties to China, to New York, to California. The case has revealed poly-drug trafficking, not just marijuana. It has revealed money laundering by groups that are likely also laundering money for Mexican cartels and proceeds from other crimes through the use of front companies in the Chinese underground banking system. This is exactly the type of organization that we as DEA should be targeting, but we're faced with physically taking down 854 grows. Being a source state really is a new reality for law enforcement in Colorado. Large, formidable trafficking organizations have established massive grow operations throughout the state. It's not like targeting a meth DTO with production labs in Mexico or a heroin distribution line whose poppy fields and heroin labs are in Mexico. We can't easily work up these cases to the kingpins, to the leaders of the organization, because we're bogged down with 854 grows. And that's the biggest challenge posed by the transnational criminal organizations involved in large-scale marijuana production in Colorado. While we're busy pulling utility records and conducting surveillance so that we can identify which grows are active, so that we can go in and cut down hundreds of plants in hundreds of grow houses, it's difficult to determine the ultimate hierarchy of these organizations that are capitalizing on the marijuana laws in Colorado. What groups are they connected to outside of Colorado? Where might they be most vulnerable to target? What other DEA offices, what other federal agencies, what other local agencies are targeting these same organizations that we don't know about? And the money. These organizations are generating millions and millions of dollars from the marijuana produced in Colorado black market grows. The Chinese groups are using Colorado businesses to move not only weed proceeds, but other illegal proceeds as well. We know they're laundering money for the Mexican DTOs that are distributing meth, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl throughout the U.S. Following that money is vital if we stand any chance to dismantling these organizations. It's a whole new paradigm. Colorado is a source state for high-grade marijuana being produced and trafficked by sophisticated national and transnational criminal organizations. There are a lot of challenges in that. But hey, it's just weed, right? It's been good for pizza sales and for the Girl Scouts. And that's all I had.
Thank you very much, Wendi.